Imagine digging up a skeleton and finding a sickle pressed against its throat or a brick shoved into its mouth. These aren't scenes from a horror movie. They're real archaeological discoveries. Across Europe, the remains of people have been found in these so-called vampire burials to stop them from rising from the dead. But why were they laid to rest this way? What did they do to strike such fear into their communities? You might be surprised to find that modern horror and fiction narratives bear little resemblance to the centuries-old beliefs and practices that people in the past turned to in an effort to ward off the misfortunes that befell them. In this video, we are going to dig deep into the real archaeology behind vampire burials. Hi, I'm your host Rachel, and not only am I an archaeologist, but I'm also a specialist in excavating human remains, and I actually worked on a vampire burial in Bulgaria. Today, we're going to look into what exactly the term vampire burial means, the folklore that motivated people to do this to the dead, the real-life examples of these burials, and what it tells us about their cultural fears, community beliefs, and how archaeologists separate myth from fact. Let's dig in to this spooky archaeological phenomenon. Warning, this video contains images of human skeletal remains and discusses how some pretty grisly things happened to people after they died. Speaking of ancient burials, did you know ancient Cypriots turned death into a competitive spectacle? This video is sponsored by ancientcyprus.com. During the Bronze Age, wealthy families would pack their tombs with dozens of ceramic vessels, gold jewelry, and imported luxuries. In fact, the majority of ancient pottery you see in museums today comes from these tombs. This competitive mortuary culture meant families used burials to display their wealth and status, turning cemeteries into arenas for social rivalry. AncientCyprus.com explores these burial traditions and the entire archaeological heritage of Cyprus. Check out their article on the evolution of Cypriot burials over time, linked in the description of this video. From Neolithic burials beneath house floors to elaborate Iron Age tombs with sacrificed horses and chariots, they document how Cypriots honored their dead across millennia. Visit ancientcyprus.com today to uncover the extraordinary stories buried beneath this ancient island. First, I want to establish what exactly I mean when I say vampire burial. This is a term often applied to human remains buried in an unusual way. The scientific term is a deviant burial. So someone has gone through the effort of burying a person's body, but there's something about the method that makes it different from the normal traditions from where it's found. In this case, it's when we find evidence that things were done post-mortem to a corpse that were in order to incapacitate it. The methods used varied greatly, but they had the same purpose: to prevent the deceased from rising from the dead. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, what is the connection of these burials to a vampire? That sounds a lot more like a zombie. Well, vampires, as we know them, are a mythical creature that feeds on a vital essence, usually blood, in order to stay alive. The notion of vampirism has existed for millennia, and cultures such as the Mesopotamians, Hebrews, ancient Greeks, Manipuri, and Romans had tales of demons and spirits, which are considered precursors to modern vampires. However, largely the folklore of the entity that we know as the vampire originates almost exclusively in southeastern Europe, where they are humanoid creatures risen up from their grave to visit loved ones and cause mischief or deaths in their communities. The earliest records of the term vampire are in English, Latin, and French, and references to vampirism are found in Russia, Poland, and North Macedonia, and more. One of the myth's origins comes from the Upiora demon in the Slavic and Turkic folklore of the Volga River and the Pontic Steppes. The modern word vampire derives from the Old Slavic and Turkic word ompyr. The modern idea of vampirism is rooted in the common Slavic belief of a stark distinction between the soul and the body. The soul was not considered to be perishable, so this means that while the physical body died, The soul would go out and wander about its neighborhood and workplace, either blessing or wreaking havoc on its family and community for 40 days before moving on to an eternal afterlife. During this time, the soul was capable of re-entering and reanimating its corpse for this wandering. Therefore, proper burial rites were extremely important to ensure its purity and peace as it separated from the body. A violent or untimely death, or the death of an unbaptized child or grievous sinner, were all situations where a soul could become unclean after death, allowing it to rise as a vampire. So naturally, it also became important that in addition to proper burial rites of an unclean soul, that they also have basically a backup where the body is put in a situation where it could not physically rise from its grave. How this was done varied a lot. A quite common method was to cut off their head and place it out of their reach, most frequently between their legs. Another method involved piercing the body with a rod or other sharp implement, or weighing it down by covering it with rocks. Vampire, or perhaps a more accurate term would be anti-vampire burials, are found all over Europe, but the most famous ones come from Eastern European countries. At the medieval cemetery of Kaldus in Poland, 14 vampire graves were found in among the hundreds of graves from this site. Some were decapitated, others were buried face down, and still more were weighed down with stones. Since one of the major hypotheses as to why people are singled out as vampires is because they were unhealthy or disabled, the researchers here decided to investigate 574 skeletons from the cemetery, looking for evidence of pathology that might identify someone as a vampire. Their research found evidence of diseases like scurvy, osteoperiosteitis, and degenerative joint disease, aka arthritis, on 238 of the skeletons that were analyzed, including on 11 out of the 14 vampires. However, the diseases identified were found to be fairly common afflictions at this site, and other burials with these same diseases were buried normally. So, broadly speaking, there was no correlation between the vampires and physical issues that we could identify that would set them apart from the rest of the population. The researchers concluded that given the high rate of pathology within half of the cemetery's population, people with long-term diseases or disabilities were perceived as normal, and whatever caused their community to view the 14 individuals as vampires was not related to their physical condition. In 2022, while excavating a 17th century cemetery in the village of Pien, the remains of a young woman aged between 17 and 21 were found with a sickle around her throat and a padlock on the big toe of her left foot. This is the first archaeologically documented case of both a sickle and padlock within a burial. Despite the classic signs that her community feared her in the afterlife, she appears to have been of high status and still received an otherwise respectful burial. Though there were no wooden remains of a coffin that survived, the team identified contours indicating that the head had rested upon a pillow and found fragments of silk threads and silver and gold weft, which were recovered from around the skull's head, that might be the remains of a bonnet. This indicates that she was not ritually murdered or convicted in a witchcraft trial, which would have been classic signs that she was considered a vampire. I find it really interesting that despite people clearly being afraid of vampires, this didn't extend to just chucking the body into a nearby river or burning it. Who that person was while they were alive still had an impact in how they were buried with respect. Also in Poland, at the post-medieval cemetery site of Drawsko, 6 individuals of the over 280 found here were classified as deviant burials and identified as possible vampire burials. 4 of them had the cutting edge of a sickle placed at their throat, 1 of them had a sickle on her abdomen, and 2 had large stones placed atop their graves. Interestingly, they were all found scattered in amongst the normal burials in the cemetery without any type of segregation, which is why the archaeologists were initially hesitant to call them vampires, thinking perhaps there was something else behind why they were buried this way. Analysis of their bones showed little evidence of traumatic injuries, bone deformation, disease, or dietary deficiencies, so again, no obvious clues as to why they might have been considered vampires. One hypothesis was that they could have been immigrants into the community, and suspicion or fear of outsiders would be why they were treated so unusually. However, analysis of the stable oxygen and carbon isotopes in their teeth revealed that they were all locals. It also seems unlikely that they were buried this way because they had an association to agriculture, which is why the sickles are included, since they are found almost uniformly around the neck with the cutting edge down, implying they're meant to cut whatever is going to try and come up, rather than down by the hand, which is where you would expect to find a much valued or sentimental tool. For now, it would seem that the most logical conclusion is that they were considered vampires, but once again, the reason they are targeted is a mystery to this day. Moving south, Bulgaria is home to more than 100 vampire burials. In 2012, 2 skeletons were found in the Black Sea town of Sozopol, with iron rods pierced through their bodies. Dating to between the 12th and 14th centuries, they were found in the remains of a church. One had a plowshare piercing through his rib cage and was found in the apse of the church, indicating he was a person of some importance. Based on the date and burial location, some local historians and archaeologists think this grave most likely belongs to that of a medieval mayor of Sozopol known as Krivich, which translates to the crooked. He is known to have had a background as a pirate and bandit, and according to legend, his nickname comes from the fact that he was crippled. He is remembered as an extremely intelligent man who outshined everyone with his knowledge about the sea, the stars, and herbs. According to Byzantine chronicles, he plundered a Venetian ship, and it is possible he was declared a master of witchcraft because of his knowledge. However, his mastery of the sea didn't extend to the land, as due to his incompetence when defending the town from a siege, Sozopol was overrun by the Genoese, who took everything away from the local residents. From what I could find online, there doesn't really seem to be much to connect this burial to Krivich besides being from the roughly right time period and being buried in an important spot in the right location. There isn't any mention that I could find on if the skeletons had any signs of a physical disability to connect him to the name, and it certainly doesn't really look like it when I look at this photo, but I mean, having a medieval vampire pirate mayor has a certain ring to it that tourists love. So I can see why people have kind of run with this theory. This vampire burial is on display at the National Museum of History in Sofia, if you feel like going to see it in person. When I was in Bulgaria on the coast of the Black Sea in 2013, doing work for my master's degree in human osteoarchaeology, the local archaeologist brought my supervisor 2 recently excavated skeletons to analyze. The results of this analysis haven't been published, and it's been over a decade since I did this work, and as a result, my memory on the details is kind of hazy, but I did find a news article about the actual excavation of these bodies, not the analysis. They were found during excavations of the St. Archangel Michael and Gabriel Church in the town of Nessebar. One was of a child buried in a coffin covered in a hard white substance. It was called whitening in the article, but I don't know what the actual term for it is. I just remember that we literally had to chip the bones out of this substance in order to look at them. This type of burial was often done in times of plague to try and prevent spread of disease. The other skeleton was an older man who was found with a knife through his ribs, approximately in the location of his heart, dating to the 17th century. This could be a criminal situation, as in he was murdered and dumped somewhere, but some archaeologists think that it might be a vampire burial. While vampire burials are most commonly found in Eastern Europe, it's not limited to that area. In 2024, archaeologists working at the Necropole de Bambini, aka the Cemetery of Infants, in Lunagno, Italy, they found the remains of a 10-year-old child lying on its side with a stone placed in its mouth. The cemetery dates to around 1500 years ago, when a deadly malaria outbreak swept the area, killing many vulnerable babies and small children. Their bodies were buried at the site of an abandoned Roman villa. The 10-year-old's burial is unique, not only as the only case found with a stone in its mouth, but also as the oldest occupant of the cemetery. The open position of the child's jaw would not have happened naturally during decomposition with the body placed on its side, and this suggests that the rock was intentionally inserted in the mouth after death. Teeth marks were found in cement on the stone, providing further evidence that it was placed purposefully. Archaeologists think the stone may have been placed to try and prevent the rising and spreading of disease. The child's remains have been dubbed by the locals as the vampire of Lunagno. Previous excavations here have also found the remains of a 3-year-old girl with her arms and legs pinned down by her stones, and artifacts associated with witchcraft like toad bones and raven claws. Similar burials have been documented in other locations in Italy. In 2009, the skeleton of an elderly woman was found with a brick in her mouth in a mass grave on Lazaretto Nuovo, an island northeast of Venice that was used as a sanatorium for plague sufferers during the medieval period. The mass grave she was found in was for victims of the Venetian plague of 1576, which killed as many as 50,000 people, nearly a third of the city's population. A multidisciplinary study of forensic, anthropological, folkloric, and chemical analyses reconstructed the life and death of this individual as far as we could, who the researchers named Carmilla. The analysis found that she had a lower class diet of mostly vegetables and grains, European ancestry, and was between 61 and 71 years old when she died, which actually isn't as shocking as you think. While the average lifespan at this time was around 40, this was due to high infant mortality rates, bringing the average down. If you survived childhood, you actually had a decent chance of living into your 60s. They also did a facial reconstruction using rigorous forensic techniques on a 3D printed replica of the skull to bring her face back to life for a National Geographic documentary called Vampire Forensics. So, how did we go from people buried with bricks in their mouths or stakes in their chests to the modern day portrayal of sexy immortals who sometimes sparkle in the sunlight? While legends about blood-drinking ghouls date back thousands of years, the vampire first became a fixture in popular fiction in 18th century poetry and 19th century short stories. The first and most influential of which was John Polidori's The Vampire, which was published in 1819, featuring the vampire Lord Ruthven. The vampire theme continued in penny dreadful serial publications such as Varney the Vampire, and culminated in the preeminent vampire novel in history, Dracula by Bram Stoker, published in 1897. What we think of as a vampire in modern day is clearly very far removed from what we find in the archaeological record. Vampire burials can be difficult to definitively identify without a doubt, as in some cases we may be misinterpreting a murder, like the Nessebar vampire, or post-depositional events in the soil that shift the burial so it ends up with an object in its mouth. It's also worth noting that it is rare to be able to determine a person's cause of death, as it needs to leave a very obvious trace on the skeletal system. And these events where these people are being staked or whatever into the ground are occurring very, very close to when that person died. And it can be really difficult to tell the difference between an injury that happened at the time of death and thus was the cause of death, or happened very shortly after a person's death. And obviously, these burials very inconveniently don't come with a handy lead inscription buried with them to explain why they were vampires. So archaeologists instead have to piece together the historical and archaeological evidence that we do have, and in some cases, a vampire burial is simply the most likely explanation. This fear of the resurrected was one of the many beliefs people of the past used to try and explain certain events of the natural world. The succession of plagues which ravaged Europe between 1300 and 1700 fostered the belief in vampires, mainly because the decomposition of corpses and the spread of disease was not well understood. For example, gravediggers reopening mass graves for new interments would sometimes come across bodies bloated by gas, the hair still growing, and blood seeping out from their mouths. And naturally, they would then think that these were still alive. The shrouds used to cover the faces of the dead were often decayed very quickly by bacteria in the mouth, revealing the corpse's teeth, and vampires thus became also known as shroud eaters. According to medieval medical and religious texts, the undead spread pestilence in order to suck the remaining life from corpses until they acquired the strength to return to the streets again. While in many cases we can't answer the question of why someone is buried as a vampire, archaeological excavation and analysis of these burials can tell us a lot about people's beliefs by the way that they treated the dead. After all, the dead don't bury themselves. So next time you hear about vampires, remember, their origins lie in real archaeological discoveries. That's it for this video. Which vampire was your favorite? What other spooky archaeological phenomenon would you like to learn about? The Curse of the Mummy, witch trials, the origins of All Hallows Eve? Let me know in the comments. If you stuck around until the end, firstly, thank you. And please don't forget to like the video if you're on mobile, hype it, share it, or subscribe to the channel before you leave. If you're feeling extra generous, you can give me a super thanks, Ko-fi donation, or check out my Redbubble shop and get a sticker, t-shirt, or whatever with your favorite archaeological slogan that I've designed. Taking a few seconds to support me in any way that you can is very much appreciated and helps grow the channel and promotes quality archaeological content that is well sourced, researched, and presented by somebody who actually is an expert in this subject. It shows the algorithm that people are interested in real archaeology, not pseudoscience or AI slop. Thank you so much for watching. Stay curious, and I hope to see you on my next adventure inside archaeology.